Good afternoon. My name is Jordan Maclean, and I am a research assistant in the Institute for Social Marketing and Health at the University of Stirling. Apologies I can't be with you all in person. Today I will talk to you about the second paper of the Limiting Virus Transmission During a Sporting Mega Event project, titled "We Wouldn't Have Missed It for the World: Stakeholder Perspectives of Hosting Euro 2020 in Pandemic Times." UEFA is the global governor of football in Europe. UEFA's bidding process for hosting Euro 2020 set out a contractual relationship in relation to host associations, host cities and stadiums. The host association's staging agreement is privity of contract, where they must provide support and execute delegated tasks from UEFA, as well as liaise with public authorities to fulfil the guarantees of the tournament. The host city agreement are the responsible municipalities who must fulfil the guarantees in the bid requirements without anything in return. This includes the stadium agreement, which relates to infrastructural requirements and services. The COVID crisis in early 2020 presented a new corridor of uncertainty between the host cities of each national governments, who have authority over public health concerns, and UEFA, the organiser of international football events. In this presentation, I examine the political governance of hosting Euro 2020 during a global pandemic. 13 stakeholders, 3 females and 10 males, participated in semi-structured interviews lasting up to 90 minutes. 10 stakeholders represented 7 of the 11 host cities, including London, Glasgow, Rome, Budapest, Amsterdam, Copenhagen and Bucharest. 2 from UEFA and 1 worked in public health. The semi-structured interview guide consisted of 5 sections. The first, background; the second, planning for Euro 2020; third, mitigation measures within the stadium; fourth, outside the stadium, travel, hospitality and fan zones; and fifth, learning from Euro 2020. The analysis involved developing a narrative around themes that denote specific phases of how Euro 2020 was staged during the COVID-19 pandemic. Themes. 3 main phases were identified from the analysis. The first, the disruption phase, captures when COVID-19 was declared a pandemic in March 2020 up until the postponement of the tournament in June 2020. The second phase is dialogue, which covers the planning of the rescheduled tournament from July 2020 up until the start of the tournament in June 2021. And third, the deliverables phase, is specific to the time of the tournament from 11th of June to 11th of July 2021. The disruption phase captures when COVID-19 was declared a pandemic in March 2020 and the postponement of the tournament in June 2020. The multi-host city venue format was set out in the bidding agreement back in 2013. It was planned for, but the pandemic was not. Consequently, host cities were left with an ultimatum: to continue in the same format or be released from their obligation with no compensation. From 13 host cities, there were now 11. Brussels had withdrawn due to new stadium delays prior to the pandemic, while other host cities could not commit to hosting the tournament. Dublin withdrew, and its matches were split between London and St. Petersburg. Bilbao was moved to Seville. For those host cities that did continue, all previous plans were to be reoriented to the pandemic. UEFA collaborated with the World Health Organization to develop risk assessments that could be used by host cities every month to determine whether it was safe to organise a tournament in June and July 2021. Interestingly, UEFA were still looking to use this tool in order to standardise the results. The comparison of different rules, including entry, quarantine and vaccinations, were being monitored between host countries, while test events were set up in the lead up to the tournament. There was a disruption to the routine planning that such events would primarily focus on, with an emphasis on COVID-19. However, some felt that there was an overemphasis on COVID, and some other risks that are attached to these events were perhaps overlooked. but despite the pandemic's disruption, the prestige of hosting Euro 2020 was seen as unmissable. The Romanian government put the event in a government decree of national importance and public interest. Another said it spurred political debates. Why can football do this? Politicians said this is a once-in-a-lifetime. Football Euro is the biggest thing. To mitigate the risk of hosting a major event in pandemic times, working groups facilitated dialogue between the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Interior, the city, and the host association. The usual rules were those in place for organising tournaments before the pandemic. Stadium footprints were compromised by the usual rules because we have never planned to have a stadium thinking about, a 1.5 metre of social distance. The rules regarding pandemics often mirrored local government legislation. Host cities had to find the right balance between the government rules and the UEFA concept. Consequently, there were requests from UEFA for exemptions to local legislation. A stakeholder at UEFA indicated that partnership was key to hosting an international tournament in pandemic times. UEFA had to liaise with host cities in countries with differing local and national legislation. Multiple pressures were evident in the dialogue between UEFA, host cities and local organising structures. Threatening to close a stadium and move it elsewhere is an example of UEFA's de facto power. Host cities felt pressured or pushed to achieve minimum stadium capacities of 25% so that UEFA's product looks good on TV. There was also political pressure from opposition government parties, where an increase in stadia capacities compromised the social distancing measures in Denmark. UEFA ran the risk of being overruled by government because local authorities were seen as the final decision makers for what UEFA can or can't do. Local authorities had to approve how the COVID-19 mitigation measures were to be implemented on site. Some governments challenged UEFA's de facto power, where all guidance in Denmark was based on the Danish authorities' guidance and not UEFA's. Mitigation measures were customised per country or per stadium, where every event was a test event. COVID guidance was reinforced to spectators via stickers at venues, with between 5,000 to 10,000 stickers in each venue. Proof of vaccination and or negative lateral flow test were considered the main mitigation measures that was implemented, that we were basically testing or ensuring that people had been vaccinated prior to entry into the stadium. But some venues, such as St. Petersburg, had no testing for fans. At other venues that did, some fans falsified their tests. And at Bucharest, there were more problems with their own staff testing than with fans themselves. As indicated by Stakeholder 11, compliance was at odds with football fandom. Compliance was not going to be high because it changes the nature of the event, where fans get swept up in the atmosphere. Compliance then was measured in accordance with what was considered compliance in terms of a football audience. Stakeholder 2 reiterated the difficulty of enforcing measures due to the nature of football fans. Indeed, they did not go in and pick people out due to the snowball effect that could create. They described it as a fine balance between implementing rules and the safety within the stadium. There were inconsistencies in how measures were enforced, where each of the stakeholders indicated that they wouldn't go in to move them apart. We would not be going in to enforce COVID mitigation, and we didn't intervene after each goal. The pandemic led to local and national governments steering the behaviour of UEFA in the disruption and dialogue phases, but less so in the deliverables phase. The first key finding is the prestige of hosting Euro 2020 was a risk worth taking despite the pandemic's disruption. The pandemic created an increasing publicisation of the private sphere. Local and national governments were more than merely gatekeepers, that is bidders, but had the ultimate authority over the staging of the tournament in their host city. The second key finding is tensions arose in the dialogue between UEFA, local organising structures and national governments due to differences in their approaches to the pandemic. The multi-host city venue format proved difficult for UEFA to standardise the delivery to fans. Consequently, UEFA's monopolised product led to some disagreements with local governments. Host cities were also pressured to achieve a minimum seating capacity of 25% of full capacity. However, according to Freeburn, pressure from international federations is not genuinely consensual but is forced. UEFA were also keen for higher attendances at showpiece matches. After all, UEFA are private companies making a huge revenue on their monopolies. The third key finding is host associations took a pragmatic approach to implementing mitigation measures, which may have been at odds with UEFA's code of conduct. Mitigation measures were shaped by stakeholder working groups in host cities, some of which were exempted from national legislation. This marked a change from previous tournaments where the state has been completely excluded from the negotiations. The hosting of Euro 2020 in pandemic times gives the impression that sport still seems to have an autonomous status that is partially removed from the public order. Hosting Euro 2020 during a global pandemic created a completely new environment for how UEFA staged an international tournament. The following recommendations can be used to support the planning of future sporting and cultural events. Tournament organisers should set up working group partnerships with key stakeholders to identify and embed best practices for reducing COVID-19 transmission. Organisers must provide all mitigation measures and equipment and be agile to adapt their procedures to changes in government legislation and local authority guidelines. Strict policing of teams and athletes, that is, mitigation measures or a bubble, is essential for the feasibility of the event. If you lose a team or athlete, then you lose the structure of the event. Finally, COVID-19 training is essential for staff responsible for applying and implementing mitigation measures. Thank you for listening. Please follow live project updates on our Twitter page @EuroCovid. Enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.